Hey everyone. This is the introduction to Norman Levine's The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels. Here's a little blurb about the book. Quote, in the contemporary world, regardless of political denomination, east or west, a global society has emerged, It is a global society which worships a pragmatic scientism, which views nature and society in terms of mechanistic determinism, end quote, says Norman Levine in his introduction. Marx's observations on this process, his theories on its origin, his suggestions on how to deal with it are a valuable part of our intellectual heritage. They have been obscured by being lumped together with the theories of his compatriot and collaborator Friedrich Engels. Before Levine analyzed the essential differences between Marxism and Engelsism, noted in the 1920s by Georgy Lukács and Karl Korsch and Antonio Gramsci, he shows that Marx was an intellectually flexible and scholarly man, unlike Engels, whom he identifies as Marx's first revisionist. Norman Levine received his doctorate in history from New York University in 1965. He is presently associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and is the author of numerous articles on Marxist thought and its application to contemporary problems. One second, actually. Okay. To my mother and father, Alice and Max Levine. I'm going to read the table of contents for the whole book. Acknowledgements, introduction by Lyman H. Legters. Foreword. Chapter 1, The Marxian View of Nature. 2, The Transcendence of Democracy. 3, Toward a Philosophical Anthropology. 4, Marx as a Jacobin. 5, The Dialectics of Revolution in the 19th Century. 6, Dialectical Naturalism as a Philosophy of History. 7, The Young Engels, 1839 to 1842. 8, The Origins of Engels' Communism. 9, The Foundation of Engels' Metaphysics. 10, The Origins of Economic Determinism. 11, Scientific Socialism as National Messianism. 12, Scientific Socialism as German Ethnocentrism. 13, Communism as Industrial Puritanism. 14, The Dutiful Disciple and the Exploitative Master. Acknowledgements. The idea of this book first came to me while I was on the faculty at DePaul University, Greencastle, Indiana. It is a product of the student movement of the late 1960s. The students at that time were eager for a knowledge of Marx, and in response to their needs, I organized a course on Marxism. My involvement in the study of Marx has not ceased since that time. The Vietnamese War and its concomitant effects upon the whole of society was a radicalizing experience. Every writer benefits from the exchange of ideas and a sympathetic ear. I am especially indebted to Professor Clifton Phillips of DePaul University, who listened long and patiently, oftentimes late into the night, while the major ideas of my thesis were first articulated. My thanks also to Professor Robert Calvert, who also listened, not sympathetically, but critically. He was a disbeliever, but I gained much in the process of overcoming this particular negation. It would be an injustice not to mention Jim Martindale, head librarian at DePaul University. Upon my request, he purchased the complete works of Marx and Engels, and without those books, my initial research would have been impossible. Once in the open seas, other helping hands were there throughout this long journey. Professor Mina Falk, emeritus professor of New York University, who launched a graduate student and convinced me that he was had a debt to words. Professor A. William Salomon, the University of Rochester, who first opened a young man's mind to the, quote, idea of history. Professor George Eggers, State University of New York at Buffalo, a generous and talented human being who gave indispensable encouragement to the unfolding of an outlandish conception. Professor Eugene Genovese, the University of Rochester, for the example he has set for a tough-minded and unflinching Marxist scholarship. Professor Robert Tucker, Princeton University, a good friend whose book Philosophy and Myth and Karl Marx opened a whole new vista for me in the perception of Marx. Professor Lyman Legters, the University of Washington, who first read an essay of mine and made me face the challenge of producing a book. I was fortunate enough to have several summers devoted to research. I am indebted to the American Philosophical Society, whose stipend allowed me to dedicate the summer of 1971 to research. I'm also indebted to the University of Maryland Baltimore County Graduate Council, particularly Professor Joseph Mulligan, for supporting my research during the summer of 1972. During both these summers, I was in Amsterdam at the International Institute of Social History, acquainting myself with the of Marx. H.B. Harstick of the Institute was singularly helpful. The secretarial staff of the History Department of the University of Maryland Baltimore County provided invaluable assistance. Without the help of Mary Dietrich, Pat Gist, Joanne Palmore, this book would still be a handwritten manuscript. Lloyd Garrison of ABC Clio Press has produced a finished and professional text. Of course, there was Rose. That is, there was encouragement, forbearance, and laughter. Okay, so here we are, introduction. I'm reading this out of the book. Actually, it's going to be the introduction and the foreword, excuse me, because the introduction is only a page long. But the introduction is by Lyman H. Legters, editor, 20th Century Series, Seattle, Washington. So, it says, each historical era, including our own contemporary era, has a characteristic set of issues, events, or series of events underlying socioeconomic tendencies and affiliations of ideas that require more than ordinary explanatory exertion. Taken together with these central issues may be regarded as the problematics of an epoch individually. However much the views of successive generations of commentators may vary, they are likely to be spoken of as pivotal or crucial elements in any coherent understanding of their era. The 20th Century Series has focused largely on rich pivotal events, tendencies, and ideas in its aim of making a contribution to the understanding of our own age. Accordingly, the books in this series emphasize interpretation rather than detailed account, analysis, and insight rather than lengthy exposition. With few exceptions, the volumes in this series have dealt with the more puzzling problems of our time, hence on those that have evoked a large body of frequently conflicting explanation. National Socialism in Germany, fascism, the Bolshevik Revolution, the outbreak of World War I are all challenging issues of this kind. So too, it is hardly necessary to add, is Marxism. At first glance, it might of course be supposed that Marxism, and especially the intellectual relationship obtaining between Marx and Engels, belongs properly to the 19th century. However, one of the defining features of ideologically informed social movements is that they seek to change as well as to explain social reality, and this necessarily entails for those movements that survive at all some projection into the future. Marxism happens to be par excellence, the intellectual and social movement that has remained a live option for generations beyond the time of its original formation, a fact that is both the emblem of its success and the explanation of the wide variety of viewpoints that now, almost a century after Marx's death, claim Marx as their authority. It follows that any serious inquiry into ambiguities or uncertainties in the origins of Marxian teaching has a decided bearing on both intellectual and practical concerns of our own era. Perhaps the greatest obstacle to constructive interpretation of Marxism in the United States has been the accident that we learned of Marx, so to speak, via Lenin. Marxism impinged on North American consciousness on a large scale, first with the Bolshevik Revolution and then with the great power conflict that followed World War II. For most Americans, this meant two things: that Marxism appeared as a threat and that alternate understandings of within Marxism, within the Marxian tradition, were overshadowed by the Soviet version. And it has taken us a long time to find our way back to the intellectual origins of Marxism, or even to the unbroken Western European tradition of critical Marxian thought and social action. It was that European Marxian tradition that gave rise to the first serious examinations of differences between Marx and Engels. Professor Norman Levine, by relying fully on the original text rather than on the often irrelevant layers of hostile, quote, refutations, end quote, has in this book aligned himself with a serious variety of Marxian explication and at the same time continued an intellectual discussion that began with Lukács. He thus joins a company of more recent investigators of the Marx-Engels relationship that includes Erich Lichtheim, Eric Hobsbawm, David McClellan, and Helmut Fleischer. The point of including his study in the 20th Century series is not that he and others named would seriously agree, but that Professor Levine, besides being serious and scholarly in his analysis, propounds a viewpoint that deserves to be heard in a discussion that is far from being finished. Lyman H. Legters, editor of the 20th Century series, Seattle, Washington. Okay, so that's the introduction. Here's the foreword. This book is intended to shed light on the destiny of Marxist thought in the 19th and 20th century. It upholds the tradition of Marxism as naturalistic humanism as negative praxis, against those who falsely presented Marxism as a mechanistic materialism and social positivism. I propose to restate the creativity and applicability of Marxist theory. That tactic is simply stated, but its execution is complex. Those elements of the Marxist tradition, many of them erroneously attributed to Marx by others, which are dogmatic, sterile, indeed distorted, must be stripped and disentangled from core Marxism. Essential Marxism must be recaptured from both the sins of history and friends. In the contemporary world, regardless of political denomination, east or west, a global society has emerged. That society is technological, bureaucratic, and centralist. It is dominated by the ethos of instrumental and functional rationality. Marxist scholarship can best respond to these unique socio-historical conditions by jettisoning those aspects of the Marxist tradition which in the socialist and communist world directly lead to these alienating and exploitative conditions. By penetrating to the Marxism of Marx, Marxist scholarship can unearth a body of theory which is both relevant critique and a radical negation of the dehumanizing aspects of the contemporary world. It will bring to the surface a partially lost, certainly obscured core of Marxist thought, capable of reviewing radicalism, and thus equipping the left with renewed philosophical and methodological viability. This book is dedicated to this task of adaptation and renewal. The pivotally important theme in this book is the separation of Marx and Engels. The central concept is that major differences of thought existed between Marx and Engels. In effect, this book argues that the two divergent modalities of a similar corpus of theory emerge. That modality which was inherent to Marx will thereafter be referred to as Marxism, and that modality which was inherent to Engels will be referred to as Engelsism. Marx and Engels assigned different weights and densities to various aspects of a similar body of knowledge. The weights and densities assigned corresponded to the innate inclination of mind of the two men, to their inbred logical presuppositions. The cumulative effect of these different insights and densities gave rise to the divergent and unique modalities of thought represented by each. The totality of the concentrations gave rise to individual forms of perception and evaluation. I am describing the effect and consequence of a mental filter. I am describing mechanisms similar to two chemical solutions through which an image of the world must pass. Solutions composed of divergent ingredients of dissimilar concentrations. Clearly, the image of the world will be presented in two different modalities as they pass through these unique solutions. Furthermore, as a consequence of the counterposing of Marx and Engels, I maintain that the misinterpretations of Marxism began with Engels. In spite of the admitted areas of agreement between Marx and Engels, these pages show Engels as the first revisionist to distort and misrepresent the ideas of Marx. That tradition of Marxism, which became mechanistic materialism, social positivism, instrumental rationality, and the morality of the Puritan work ethic and self-denial in the dress of socialist productivity, found its point of origination, its genesis with Engels. I have arrived at this conclusion independently, yet I note that a creative generation of Marxist scholars perceived the contradiction between Marx's naturalism and Engels' mechanistic materialism during the 1920s. The published works of Georg Lukács, Karl Korsch, and Antonio Gramsci reveal that these men were aware that Engels distorted Marxism by applying the dialectic to nature. Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci all recognized that the dialectic was a methodology, not a law of nature, that history is a record of human activities within given social conditions and not a verification of positivist laws. The creative Marxism of Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci was buried for a time under Stalin's repressive totalitarianism, and it was not revived until the 1960s. Regretfully, those men did not pursue their perceptions and insights to a logical conclusion, so their work failed to alter the prevailing interpretation among their contemporaries, i.e. that Marx and Engels spoke with a single voice. Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, Mao, and the contemporary world all held that view, and recent scholarship has recently tended to reinforce the theme of essential unanimity between Marx and Engels. The theme was articulated by Franz Mehring and Karl Marx, Gustav Meyer in his biography of Friedrich Engels, and by Isaiah Berlin in his Karl Marx, The History of Socialist, his Karl Marx, The History of Socialist Thought by G.D.H. Cole, and To the Finland Station by Edmund Wilson are based on the assumption of unanimity, and the French school of structural Marxism, Louis Althusser, adopts that assumption as doctrine. The tragic deception, Marx contra Engels, is the only attempt to investigate an opposing view in depth. My goal in these pages is both to extend the work of Lukács, Korsch, and Gramsci, as well as to add new and as yet unseen perspectives to the Marx-Engels problem. The new contributions made by this book arise from the attempt to explain the origins as well as the consequences of the difference between Marx and Engels concerning the philosophy of nature. It is not content to state, as Korsch, Gramsci, and Lukács did, that Engels erred in applying dialectics to natural phenomenon, but seek to uncover what in Engels' philosophical understanding, what in Engels' intellectual predisposition led Engels to attempt this synthesis. Furthermore, once the reasons for the difference between Marx and Engels over the philosophy of nature are clarified, the implication of these differences will be traced to their divergent views of the future communist society and the evolutionary process of history. Lastly, I will take note of the absence of a philosophical anthropology in Engels. Unlike Marx, Engels was not influenced by Feuerbachian naturalism and consequently was not only led to define communism differently than Marx, but also the nature of the state and bureaucracy. We are observing the root experience of revisionism. We are an audience to the process by which a disciple revises the root teachings of the teacher. We are watching this irremovable subjectivity, these filters of presupposition bring forth Marxism and Engelsism. Engels was the first revisionist, the point of origin of the bifurcation of the world Marxist movement, to approach the history of socialism as reflecting two modalities, two centripetal forces, Marxism and Engelsism, does immediate violence to traditional forms of understanding the history of socialism. But such an approach is absolutely necessary if we are to comprehend how 20th century socialism was interpreted as social positivism, how 20th century socialism came to view the communist society as a once centralist and disciplinarian. It was the influence and prestige of Engels which predisposed the second generation of Marxists like Kautsky and Lenin to envision communism as a kind of factory Puritanism and history as a cosmologically determined process. There was a clear and steady evolution from Engels to Lenin to Stalin. Lenin belonged to the great age of transmission. Lenin was a member of the second generation of Marxists who transmitted the teachings of Marx from their 19th century setting to their 20th century environment. Lenin's pivotal figure contributed significantly to the belief that Marx-Engels composed one doctrine, one unified system of thought. Engels lived until 1895. Engels cast an imposing shadow, and Lenin referred to Engels as often as Lenin did to Marx. Bolshevism thus certified that Marx and Engels were of one mind and one voice. One pillar of Bolshevism was the inherent unity of Marx and Engels. Lenin, however, was a problematic schizoid figure. Lenin defended communism as a centralist society, defined communism as a disciplinarian society, equated communism with technological growth, at times affirmed that the laws of history necessitated the growth of capitalism throughout the world, and Lenin wrote Materialism and Imperial Criticism. In all these actions, Lenin was a disciple of Friedrich Engels. Lenin's definition of communism was a perpetuation of the Puritan work ethic. Lenin's concentration upon industrially modernizing Russian society, and Lenin's stress upon increased productivity, enlarged consumption, and expanded acquisition all derived from Engels, leaving aside the totalitarian aspect of Soviet communism, which in no way derives from either Engels or Marx. The rigidity, the Calvinist repressiveness of Soviet Russia was fully foreshadowed in the writings of Engels and Lenin. Soviet communism has been basically responsible for overlooking the humanistic, creative, spontaneous aspect of Marx. It has contributed to the immediately pressing contemporary problems of technological inhumanity and Puritan acquisitiveness, in short, egoistic greed. Stalin carried this tradition of Engels and the Engelsian side of Lenin to its extreme. Stalinism was a fusion of political authoritarianism and ideological uniformity. Stalin imposed this doctrinal dogmatism as ruthlessly as his demand for political subservience. The ideas of historical inevitability and social disciplinarianism were important buttresses for Stalinist totalitarianism. Thus, the period of creative Marxism in the 1920s succumbed to Stalinist rigidity, and Stalin was representative of the splintering and division of the world Marxist movement. When Marxism bifurcated, Stalin symbolized the Caesarian line of this mutation. Engels was not Caesar-papist. I don't know what the hell that means. Yet it is necessary to return to the point of origination to Engels in order to understand Stalin as a product of history. As indicated above, there was a Marxian side to Lenin. Lenin's philosophical notebooks was in the Marxian mode. Lenin's view of the revolutionary role of the peasants when he pointed out the progressive anti-imperialist role of nationalism, when he described the tactical significance of guerrilla warfare, when he stressed that a full revolution must involve the seizure of power, he emerged as a true advocate of Marx. Lenin was a genius of political strategy. At crucial points, however, Lenin deviated from the political formulas of Marx. Lenin misunderstood what Marx meant by the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, and Lenin misunderstood what Marx felt was the relationship between the social and political aspects of a true revolution. Lenin also grossly underestimated the need to continue a policy of coalition with the non-Bolshevik left after his assumption of power. When Lenin revised the political equations of Marx, Lenin did so in favor of a Blancist revolutionary elitism, a voluntarism traditional to the Russian intelligentsia. In addition, Lenin's thinking had some dormant totalitarian features. Nevertheless, Marx and Lenin were in basic agreement on the necessity of acquiring political power in the process of revolution. Marx did not feel that one must wait for the inevitable tides of history to produce a full-blown capitalism before indulging in insurrection. If not the communist revolution, Marx considered some form of progressive socialist revolution to be possible in China or Asiatic Russia. Furthermore, on the basis of the 1848 revolution, Marx realized that there would be times when the proletariat would not have sufficient strength to initiate insurrections. In those cases, Marx surmised that the proletariat would be forced to ally with bourgeois, petit bourgeois, or peasant forces. Later on, the revolution must become permanent. That is, when the conditions were ripe, the proletariat must break with these opportunistic coalitions and proceed to develop its own communist revolution. The Marxian side of Lenin was the revolutionary tradition, the side of critical political praxis, of negating and transcending activist behavior. The duality of Lenin's thought returns us to a consideration of the diverse traditions of socialism, Marxism, and Engelsism. My bias is apparent. I consider that Marx had the most creative, imaginative, and relevant mind, but I do not intend to set up Engels as a straw man. I want to salvage what is still relevant in Marx, but I do not ascribe all that is past and outmoded to Engels. In my attempt to resurrect Marx, I do not intend to crucify Engels. Nothing in these pages is intended to deny the contribution of Engels. Engels made a personal commitment to Marx of immense proportions. More than anyone else, Engels sustained and nurtured the socialist movement after the death of Marx. Engels made a personal and individually unique contribution to socialist thought, and his literature played an important role in Western Europe before World War II, which was destined to have great historical influence and which formed the ideological basis of scriptural Bolshevism. Engels achieved greatness. However, in judging and evaluating Engels and Engels' contributions, I conclude that his mind was of a second order when compared to that of Marx. In truth, Engels is not disadvantaged in this comparison with Marx. Rather, Marx suffers historically from his entanglement with Engels. The search for the essential Marx is a critical function, and so is the search for the essential Engels, and both men gain by being seen separately. When seen in their own terms, they must be judged in their own terms. When the critical function indicates that the thoughts of Engels became the basis of Soviet ideology, is not to use Engels as a straw man, it is to state a historical fact. Indeed, it is inexplicable to assume there was an inclusive unanimity of viewpoint between Marx and Engels or any two human beings. That assumption would belie human subjectivity. Philosophically and psychologically, no two people perceive or understand objects in exactly the same way. Thus, to say that Marx and Engels disagreed is simply to assert the irreducible existential element of human subjectivity. Both men looked at a common body of knowledge and inevitably came to differing interpretations. The thesis that there are two modalities, two gravitational fields, one Marxism and the other Engelsism, is simply a restatement of the argument and consequences of human subjectivity. This book focuses upon the domain of personal viewpoint and explores it in depth. Thanks for listening. This has been the foreword and the introduction to The Tragic Deception, Marx, Contra, Engels by Norman Levine. Thanks for listening.